Okay, could you repeat the first question for me?
Of course. So basically, my question was, how do you theologically distinguish between suffering that comes from obedience in general and suffering that comes specifically from preaching the gospel, since preaching is also an act of obedience?
I think there is a need to distinguish these two types of suffering because uh, the suffering that comes from preaching the gospel is mainly burdened, is mainly carried uh, by pastors, those who are entrusted with secrets of God's message.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. I think that's a really good distinction. So you're basically saying that the suffering from preaching the gospel tends to be something that falls heavily on those who are specifically entrusted with that mission, like pastors or those who are really out there proclaiming the word. Whereas suffering from obedience can be more universal to all believers who are just trying to live faithfully. I love that perspective. Let's keep going from there.
Okay, do you have any other question regarding the passage?
Absolutely. Let's keep the
Okay, cool.
conversation rolling. So, building on that, here's another question for you. How do you see the role of the church community in supporting believers who are facing these different types of suffering? In other words, how does the community help individuals who are going through suffering from obedience versus those who are going through suffering from preaching?
Where living a church-centered life is essential for believers because in Jesus said in Luke chapter 10, uh, keeping the law is about loving God and loving our neighbors, and this is essential. This is an essential requirement in order to inherit eternal life. Meaning, if we want to inherit eternal life, we must love God and our neighbors. And loving God involves loving the church, which He has bought with the price of His Son, and loving each community. Therefore, loving the church is love. Therefore, a church life which involves loving the church and its community is inseparable from inheriting the eternal life.
Absolutely. I think that's a really strong point. So, in other words, the church community is kind of the heart of how believers support each other through these different kinds of suffering. Whether someone is dealing with the challenges that come from just living faithfully or from actually preaching the gospel, the church is that place where love for God and love for neighbor come together and help everyone stay on track. I think you've nailed it.
Okay, do you have any other question about the passage?
Absolutely. Let's dive into another angle. So, here's another question for you. In the passage, there's a lot of emphasis on persecution and the idea that suffering for the gospel is inevitable. How do you think we can help modern believers understand that persecution might look different today, but the principle of remaining faithful is still the same?
There is still uh, persecution to those who preach the gospel, and of God the true gospel of God is this: uh, inheriting the eternal life requires obedience to the law. However, the most prevalent misconception among believers is that a mere confession of faith alone leads to heaven, and which contradicts the true message of heaven uh, in the Bible. So those who proclaim this truth inevitably face persecution uh, from most believers who hold on to this falsehood. So even to this day, preaching the gospel is not without persecution.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. So, even today, we can help believers understand that while the nature of persecution might look a bit different, maybe it's more social or comes from misunderstandings within the church community, the principle is still the same. Staying faithful to the true message of the gospel will always come with challenges. And the church community is there to help each other stand firm, no matter what that looks like today. Thanks for diving into that.
Wow. I think it's really a good distinction. Suffering from the preaching the gospel tends to be something that falls heavily on those who are specifically entrusted with the mission, like pastors or those who are really out there proclaim the word. Whereas suffering from obedience can be more universal to all believers who are just trying to live faithfully. The church community is the kind of heart of how believers support each other through these different kinds of suffering. Whether someone is, we can help believers understand that while the nature of persecution might look at a bit different, maybe it's more social or comes from misunderstandings within the church community. Staying faithful to the true message of the gospel will always come with these challenges.